The making of the Crossbow Cannibal. When the name Crossbow Cannibal first hit British headlines in 2010, it sent a shockwave across the nation. It was the kind of tabloid nickname that seemed almost too lurid, too grotesque to be true. But Stephen Griffiths earned it in blood. He was no ordinary criminal. He was a man who had studied serial killers, idolized their infamy, and in the end, became one of the darkest figures in modern British crime. Convicted of the murders of 3 women, Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage, and Suzanne Bamires, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The chilling twist: one of his murders was captured on CCTV. For the first time in history, a serial killer was caught on camera in the very act of killing. And yet, questions linger to this day. Did he kill only 3 women? Or were there more victims, hidden in shadows, erased by a man who once whispered to neighbors? There's a lot more than this. To understand how Griffiths became the Crossbow Cannibal, we have to look not just at his crimes, but at his life, his obsessions, and the disturbing ways he fashioned himself into a killer. The red light district of Bradford, West Yorkshire, is a city with a dark shadow over it. To the outside world, it is a place of history, industry, and multicultural vibrancy. But to criminologists, it's also infamous as the hunting ground of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who terrorized northern England in the 1970s and early 1980s. Stephen Griffiths lived in Homefield Court, a block of flats that looked down onto Thornton Road, right on the edge of Bradford's red light district. Women walked those streets night after night, some of them struggling with addiction, others trying to earn enough money to survive. It was a vulnerable community, and predators knew it. Griffiths was no stranger to that history. As a criminology student, he would have studied Sutcliffe's case in detail. To him, the Yorkshire Ripper was not just a figure from the past, but a blueprint. And for a man obsessed with serial killers, what better place to live than in the very district once haunted by Britain's most notorious murderer? The first disturbing sign: Stephen Griffiths was born in 1969 in Batley, West Yorkshire. Outwardly, his early life didn't stand out. But even in childhood, there were cracks forming in his personality. Reports suggest he tortured animals as a boy, a red flag often seen in the early development of violent offenders. At 18, Griffiths committed his first major crime. He robbed a shop and slashed the shopkeeper's face with a knife. For that, he was sentenced to 3 years in a young offenders institution. By the time he emerged, his fascination with violence had deepened. Psychologists who assessed him in the early 1990s noted signs of a personality disorder, specifically schizoid tendencies. He struggled with relationships, preferred isolation, and harbored sadistic fantasies about control and harm. One psychiatrist later admitted, "I thought it was likely he would go on to commit serious offenses. What I couldn't say was when." That when would come almost 2 decades later. A student of murder by the 2000s, Griffiths was presenting himself as an academic. He was enrolled as a PhD criminology student studying serial killers. On paper, it looked like an intellectual pursuit. In reality, it was a mask. He didn't just want to study killers. He wanted to be one. He consumed literature about murderers, idolized notorious figures, and even made references to them in casual conversation. Police later discovered he had modeled parts of his life on infamous murderers such as Peter Sutcliffe and Robert Black. To him, serial killers were not cautionary tales, they were inspirations. And all the while, he was living among some of society's most vulnerable women, sex workers who walked the same streets Sutcliffe once stalked. The victims. By 2010, Griffiths had already claimed multiple lives. The 3 women he was convicted of killing shared not only tragic fates but similar vulnerabilities. Susan Rushworth, 43, disappeared in June 2009. A mother and grandmother, she struggled with addiction and sometimes worked in the sex trade. Her body has never been found. Shelley Armitage, 31, vanished in April 2010. Like Susan, she battled drug dependency and was part of Bradford's sex work community. Suzanne Bamires, 36, was last seen on May 21, 2010. Within days, she would become the victim whose final moments were recorded by CCTV. Each woman was part of the same marginalized group Griffiths targeted deliberately. He knew society often turned a blind eye to their disappearances. To him, that made them easier prey. The CCTV murder on May 21, 2010, Griffiths lured Suzanne Bamires into his flat at Homefield Court. CCTV cameras in the corridor captured everything. At first, the The two walked calmly together toward his door. Minutes later, Suzanne bolted from the flat in terror, sprinting down the corridor. Griffiths emerged with a crossbow. He fired once, missing her. Panicked and paralyzed with fear, Suzanne froze. Griffiths chased her, reloaded, and shot again, this time fatally. Then, in a moment as chilling as it was bizarre, he turned to the camera, raised the crossbow, and gestured triumphantly. It was the first time in history a serial killer had been caught on camera committing murder. For criminologists, the footage revealed more than just brutality. It showed a man who was prepared, forensically aware, and practiced. Griffiths wore gloves inside the flat to avoid leaving prints, but he didn't wear them outside, showing he understood forensic risk. He wasn't sloppy, he was calculating. And yet, in killing Suzanne in front of the CCTV, he made a mistake that would end his killing spree. The arrest and the shocking words. When police arrested Griffiths, neighbors watched him being taken away. Some reported that as he was led to the van, he shouted, "Was it a taunt, a confession, or simply another manipulation by a man who enjoyed control?" At the police station, he admitted calmly to killing 3 women. But in his first interview, he hinted at 5. He even spoke about cannibalism, claiming he had eaten parts of his first 2 victims. Was it true? Or was it a way of cementing his place in the pantheon of infamous killers? For investigators, it raised a disturbing possibility. The 3 convictions might not represent the full extent of his crimes. The cannibal claim Griffiths' mention of cannibalism horrified even seasoned detectives. He claimed he had eaten parts of his first 2 victims, and that with the 3rd, he wanted to try raw flesh. To some experts, this sounded like fantasy, an attempt to shock, to elevate himself into a realm of infamy. But psychologists pointed out something more disturbing. Cannibalism is often about ultimate control. To consume another person is to dominate them completely. For Griffiths, who already reveled in sadistic control, it might not have been fantasy at all. A calculated killer. Police searches of the river Aire revealed gruesome evidence. Over 80 body parts were recovered, most belonging to Suzanne Blamires. Among them, investigators also found a single vertebra belonging to Shelley Armitage. Blood evidence from all 3 women was discovered in Griffiths' flat. The brutality of dismemberment, the disposal of remains in waterways, the use of power tools. It all pointed to a killer who was methodical, practiced, and chillingly unemotional. Griffiths was no frenzied murderer. He was deliberate. He had constructed his life around killing. More than 3. Despite his conviction for 3 murders, doubts persist. Why did he claim 5 victims? Why did he gesture so triumphantly at the CCTV camera, as if craving notoriety? Why did he drop names of other infamous killers during interviews, almost as if aligning himself with their ranks? Criminologists argue that serial killers rarely emerge fully formed at the point we first discover them. They are a long time in the making. If Griffiths was capable of killing with such forensic awareness in 2009 and 2010, what was he doing in the 1990s and early 2000s? Unsolved murders of sex workers in northern England during that time suddenly demand a closer look. This is the beginning of the Crossbow Cannibal case, a man who studied murder until he became its embodiment. But to truly understand the scale of his crimes, we must dig deeper into the evidence, the interviews, and the cold cases that still haunt the streets of Bradford. Because the question is not just how many women Stephen Griffiths killed, but how many he got away with before anyone ever noticed. CCTV, confession, and cannibalism. On May 25, 2010, a staff member at Homefield Court sat down to review CCTV footage from the building's security system. What he expected to see were the usual recordings of tenants coming and going, neighbors returning with groceries, or visitors knocking on doors. What he found instead would become one of the most chilling discoveries in British criminal history. There, preserved forever on a grainy digital recording, was the murder of Suzanne Blamires. The man holding the crossbow, dragging her back down the corridor, was Stephen Griffiths. For detectives, it was a once-in-a-lifetime moment. The first time in the world a serial killer had been caught on camera in the very act of killing. But for criminologists, the footage revealed far more than brutality. It was a glimpse into the method of a man who had honed his craft in secret for years. The murder on camera. The footage begins innocently enough. Suzanne walks with Griffiths down the corridor toward his flat. She looks relaxed, unaware she has entered the orbit of a predator. Minutes later, the camera captures her sudden sprint back down the hallway, panic etched across every movement. Griffiths emerges, crossbow in hand. He fires once. The bolt misses. But Suzanne is frozen in terror, almost paralyzed by fear. Griffiths reloads quickly, giving chase. This time, he strikes her down. Then comes the most haunting moment of all. Griffiths turns, looks straight into the camera, and raises the crossbow in triumph. He knows he's being recorded. He acknowledges it, almost as though he is proud. For investigators, the scene was horrifying. For criminologists, it was revealing. Forensic awareness, one detail stood out to experts who studied the tape. When Griffiths entered his flat with Suzanne, he was not wearing gloves. But when he came out, he had them on. Why? Because inside the flat, he knew he would come into direct contact with her body. He didn't want to leave fingerprints or DNA. Later, when he reemerged from the flat a second time, he had changed gloves again, now wearing fingerless ones. These were not the actions of a sloppy killer. They were the actions of someone who understood forensics, someone who had studied crime scenes, and someone who knew how investigators worked. This was a criminology student who had put his knowledge into practice. Fantasy vs. reality. What the tape also showed was the gap between Griffiths' fantasy of murder and its reality. He had studied serial killers, idolized them, and even styled himself after them. But when the moment came, his actions revealed panic and imperfection. He missed his first shot. He fumbled. Suzanne tried to escape. Killing was not as seamless as he had imagined. And in that chaos, he exposed himself to the one thing serial killers fear most: evidence. Without the CCTV, Suzanne's disappearance might have been dismissed as another vulnerable woman lost to the streets of Bradford. With it, Griffiths was finished. The police response: when detectives from West Yorkshire Police first saw the tape, they could hardly believe it. Here was irrefutable proof. A man killing a woman in cold blood, on camera, inside a residential building. Within hours, Griffiths was arrested. Neighbors watched as he was taken away. Some heard him shout, "There's a lot more than this." Those words chilled everyone. Were they a taunt? A confession? A way of toying with the authorities? Or was Griffiths revealing the truth? That 3 murders were only the beginning. The confession at the police station, Griffiths surprised detectives. Instead of denying the charges, he admitted calmly to killing 3 women. He named them Susan Rushworth, missing since 2009, Shelley Armitage, gone since April 2010, Suzanne Myers, the woman from the CCTV. He spoke about the killings with a cold detachment, as if describing shoplifting or petty theft. His tone was robotic, emotionless, devoid of remorse. Detectives asked if there were more victims. Griffiths hinted at 5, but when pressed, he withdrew, sticking firmly to 3. Why? Some criminologists believe he was playing a game, dangling information, withholding just enough to keep control. It was a technique practiced by other infamous killers, including the Moors murderers, who used secrecy as a weapon of power. The dismemberment: Griffiths also confessed to dismembering his victims. He admitted to using power tools on their bodies and disposing of remains in the River Aire. His flat, when searched, contained traces of blood belonging to multiple victims. Police divers scoured the river and made horrifying discoveries. Over 80 body parts were recovered, most belonging to Suzanne Myers. A single vertebra from Shelley Armitage was also found. Blood evidence tied Susan Rushworth to Griffiths' flat, though her body was never located. The sheer scale of the dismemberment shocked investigators. It was not impulsive. It was deliberate, methodical, practiced. The cannibalism claim. Then came the revelation that gave Griffiths his nickname. During interviews, he told detectives he had eaten parts of his first 2 victims. With the third, he said he wanted to try raw flesh to test a cultural taboo. Was it true? Or was it a performance designed to shock? Some experts argue Griffiths exaggerated to elevate himself into the ranks of infamous killers, but others believe him. Forensic psychologists note that cannibalism represents ultimate domination, the consumption of another person, erasing their existence entirely. If Griffiths did eat his victims, it was not out of necessity. It was out of control, out of sadistic fantasy. The victims behind the headlines amid the lurid stories of crossbows and cannibalism. The women Griffiths killed risked being reduced to footnotes. But they were more than victims. Susan Rushworth was a mother and grandmother. Though she struggled with addiction, her family described her as loving and kind. She disappeared in June 2009 after leaving her home in Bradford. For over a year, Her family lived with uncertainty until Griffiths admitted to her murder. Her body has never been found. Shelley Armitage dreamed of becoming a model. She had worked in the sex trade but told friends she hoped to leave it behind. In April 2010, she vanished. For weeks, her family prayed for her return. Instead, police recovered fragments of her remains from the river. Suzanne Myers was remembered by her mother as a caring daughter who once dreamed of becoming a nurse. Addiction had pulled her into prostitution, but she was still loved. On May 21, 2010, she entered Griffiths' flat. Days later, her body was found in pieces. For criminologists, understanding the victims is crucial. They were not faceless names. They were women with hopes, struggles, and families. And it was precisely their vulnerability that made them targets. The interview room. The only police officer ever to interview Griffiths extensively was Detective Sergeant John Lee. He described Griffiths as almost shy, emotionless, detached. When asked why he killed, Griffiths simply said, "I don't know." His answers were flat, robotic. He admitted to 3 murders as calmly as others might admit to a minor theft. He volunteered details without hesitation: dismemberment, disposal, cannibalism, but carefully stopped short of confirming more than 3. It was as if he had rehearsed his confession, calculating exactly how much to reveal. A student of killers, a teacher of fear throughout his interviews, Griffiths dropped names of other infamous killers: Robert Black, Peter Sutcliffe. It was as though he saw himself among them, part of a lineage of murderers. He wasn't content to be a criminal. He wanted to be remembered. Criminologists believe this is key. Griffiths was modeling himself, aspiring to notoriety. He wanted a name. He wanted to be studied the way he had studied others, and in some twisted way, he achieved it. The discovery of remains, just a day after Griffiths' arrest, workers near the River Aire spotted a bag tangled in debris. Inside was a human head. Forensic analysis revealed it belonged to Suzanne Myers. Embedded within it were a knife and a crossbow bolt, the final proof of her death. The discovery triggered an intensive search. Police recovered 80 body parts, carefully catalogued by forensic teams. The remains painted a gruesome picture of Griffiths' methods: precision cuts, deliberate concealment, a chilling detachment. But among the parts, investigators found something else: a vertebra belonging to Shelley Armitage. It confirmed what Griffiths had already admitted. He hadn't killed once. He had killed at least 3 times. The mystery of Susan Rushworth. Only Susan's body was never recovered, but blood traces in Griffiths' flat tied him to her disappearance. Her murder was accepted by the court, though without remains. Her family was denied the closure of a proper burial. For criminologists, this raises another question. If Griffiths was meticulous in dismembering and disposing of Susan, Shelley, and Suzanne, why was Susan's body never found? Did he experiment with a different disposal method, or does her body remain hidden somewhere undiscovered? 3 or more. When Griffiths stood in court in December 2010, he was convicted of 3 murders. He was sentenced to life without parole, but many remain convinced he killed more. Why did he shout, "There's more than this," as police arrested him? Why did he initially say 5 victims, only to retreat to 3? And what about the similarities between his known crimes and unsolved cases of missing sex workers in the 1990s and 2000s? Criminologists studying his behavior point to a pattern: victim selection, dismemberment, forensic awareness, and geography. These elements could tie him to other cold cases, but without confession or physical evidence, the answers remain locked inside Stephen Griffiths' mind. A killer's legacy, the Crossbow Cannibal case, is remembered for its grotesque details. The crossbow, the cannibalism, the CCTV, but its deeper lesson is about the long shadow of violent fantasy. Griffiths didn't emerge fully formed in 2009. He had been building toward this for decades. From his teenage knife attack, to his obsession with killers, to his criminology studies, every step pointed toward violence. And yet, no one stopped him. For Bradford, the scars run deep. Once haunted by the Yorkshire Ripper, the city became the hunting ground of another predator, this time one who wanted not just to kill, but to be remembered. Stephen Griffiths confessed to 3 murders, but his words, his gestures, and his fascination with infamy leave us with a haunting question: did the Crossbow Cannibal kill more than we will ever know? The past, the cold cases, and the shadow of more victims. When Stephen Griffiths was sentenced in 2010 to life without parole, the court declared that justice had been served for the 3 women he had murdered. But for criminologists, psychologists, and the families of other missing women, The story didn't end there. Instead, it opened a darker question. Was Griffiths' killing spree truly limited to 3? Or had he been perfecting his craft years before he was ever caught? To answer that, we have to look backward, into his early years, into the warning signs ignored, and into the unresolved murders that now hover like ghosts over his case. A troubled boyhood, Stephen Griffiths was born in 1969 in Batley, West Yorkshire, the eldest of 3 siblings. At school, he appeared shy and introverted. Teachers described him as quiet, even awkward. But behind the quiet exterior were behaviors that alarmed some of those around him. From a young age, Griffiths displayed cruelty toward animals. In criminology, this is often referred to as part of the MacDonald Triad, a cluster of childhood behaviors: animal cruelty, fire setting, and persistent bedwetting that can sometimes foreshadow violent criminality later in life. Griffiths' abuse of animals suggested an early appetite for control and harm. By the time he was a teenager, his behavior escalated. At 18, he committed his first serious offense. He robbed a shop and slashed the shopkeeper across the face with a knife. For that crime, he was sentenced to 3 years in a young offenders institution. It was a formative period. Instead of rehabilitation, the experience seemed to harden him. Psychological assessments. During his teenage years, psychologists assessed Griffiths, and their conclusions were alarming. Dr. Wood, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated him, diagnosed him with schizoid personality traits. The hallmarks of that condition: difficulty forming relationships, emotional detachment, a preference for isolation, fantasies of domination and sadism. Dr. Wood later recalled, "It was plain from the start that he was a very troubled young man. He had sadistic fantasies. I thought it was likely he would go on to commit serious offenses. What I couldn't say was when or what type of offenses they would be." Griffiths' fascination with sadistic control was already visible in the early 1990s, nearly 2 decades before he killed Susan, Shelley, and Suzanne. In hindsight, those psychological reports read like a warning unheeded. Abusive relationships. By the early 2000s, Griffiths' disturbing behavior extended into his personal relationships. One former partner, Kathy Hancock, described their 6-month relationship as a nightmare. She said Griffiths was manipulative, skilled at exploiting insecurities, and increasingly violent. He physically assaulted her, broke her nose, stabbed her in the legs, and once even attempted to overdose her on drugs. When she became pregnant, Griffiths' behavior grew stranger still. The pregnancy ended ectopically, but Griffiths kept a positive test strip and constructed a tiny coffin for it. For Kathy, it was a terrifying glimpse into his twisted psychology. For criminologists, it was another example of his obsession with control, morbidity, and ritual. Kathy later reflected that losing the pregnancy may have saved her life. "I'd have been stuck with him forever." In a way, it was a godsend. These episodes paint a picture of a man already spiraling long before his first known murder. If he was capable of such violence toward partners, it raises an unsettling question: what was he capable of doing to women he didn't love? The cold cases. After Griffiths' arrest, police and criminologists began revisiting unsolved murders of sex workers across northern England. Between 1991 and 2010, at least 5 unsolved cases seemed, on the surface, to match his pattern of victim selection and geography. Some could be ruled out. Griffiths was in prison when one of the murders occurred, and others didn't fit his known methods. But 2 cases stood out: the murders of Dawn Shields in 1994 and Rebecca Hall in 2001. The case of Dawn Shields, in May 1994, 19th year, old Dawn Shields disappeared from Sheffield's red light district. Just days later, her body was discovered in a shallow grave in the picturesque Peak district at Mamtor in Derbyshire. She had been stripped naked and suffered severe head injuries. The killer had taken time to conceal her body beneath a mound of stones, suggesting a calculated approach. For investigators at the time, the murder was puzzling. It was isolated, remote, and unusually careful in its concealment. There was no forensic evidence tying anyone to the crime. For criminologists reviewing it after Griffiths' conviction, several details stood out. Dawn was a sex worker. Like Griffiths' later victims, the concealment of her body showed calculation. The forensic cleanliness of the scene suggested awareness. But doubts remain. Could Griffiths, at only 24 years old and fresh out of prison, have already been this calculating? Was he forensically aware enough in 1994 to leave behind so little evidence? Some experts are skeptical. Others argue that serial killers often begin earlier than we think, and Dawn may have been his first known victim. The case of Rebecca Hall, 2000. Of all the cold cases, none is more compelling than Rebecca Hall's. Rebecca was a 19-year-old sex worker who disappeared from Bradford's red light district in April 2001. 2 weeks later, her body was discovered in a car park. She had been stripped and battered to death. The location of her murder was significant. Rebecca's body was found less than a kilometer from Homefield Court, where Griffiths later lived and killed. Witnesses later confirmed that Rebecca had been inside Homefield Court, smoking with other girls in Griffiths' flat. One long-time acquaintance testified